here's my reading statistics for February and all the books that I read in this month. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are not quite sure who I am, then my name is Chloe, this is my channel, and I post 2 videos every week on Wednesdays and Saturdays. I make videos about books and reading and all that lovely nerdy stuff, so if that's something you're interested in, then make sure to click the subscribe button. I'm currently filming this video on the 28th of February, so technically, like, I could read another book. I've just started a graphic novel which I could potentially be finishing today. However, I'm just going to talk about the books that I've already properly read and finished. But first of all, before I actually talk about the individual books, I thought I would start with some stats. We are going to start off with how many books I read this month. This month, I'm pretty proud of myself because I read 13 books, and I think for some people that's not that much. For other people it's a lot of books to read. For me, it is, for my average number of books a month, I think it's on the higher end. As I said, 13 this month versus 9 last month. This month I also read 4,172 pages, which, like, numbers like that really don't mean anything unless you compare it to something. So that is in comparison to 3,110, which I read last month. As far as ratings go, I had a pretty good month. This month I read 2 books which I just didn't give ratings, and I'll explain why that is later on in the video. I read 1 2-star book, I read 3 3-star books, I read 5 4-star books, and then I read 2 books which I gave 5 stars. As far as genre goes, I've tried to do a bit of a breakdown, but some of these books just cannot really be classified as one genre, but I've just put them into the genre that I feel like it suited them best. So I read 2 literary fiction books, I read 1 book which I classified as sci-fi, I read 4 books which I classify as horror, 1 fantasy, 1 contemporary, 2 poetry collections, which is something new for me because I honestly don't think I've read any poetry collections before February, so I'm pretty proud of myself for that one. And then I also read 1 thriller and 1 book which I classified as historical fiction. Obviously next month when I do my March wrap up, I will be comparing the statistics here with statistics for March. So the first book that I read in the month of February was Where the Crawdads Sing. When it comes to literary fiction, I'm still not sure what exactly I like, so sometimes it can be a bit difficult for me to be really drawn to a literary fiction book. But I really enjoyed this. I gave it 5 stars, and I know that there's some people that really didn't like this. I have a feeling this book is very Marmite, that you either love it or you hate it or just don't really like it. But I really enjoyed it, and there's just been so much hype around it. I think that's another reason why I was hesitant to pick it up, but when I did, I just really enjoyed it. This book centers around a girl called Kaya Clark. Other people in the town that she lives in, they refer to her as the Marsh Girl because when she was younger, her family deserted her essentially. So essentially this girl is left to her own devices. She has to look after herself, and she lives in a shack essentially. It's not a very nice house that she lives in, and she has not been brought up in the same way that other kids have. So she doesn't go to school and she doesn't act the same way as a lot of other kids. And this book has a dual timeline. On the one hand, we are looking at Kaya and how she's growing up and how she goes from being a 6-year-old girl to being a very articulate and a very clever and a very intuitive woman, and then on the other hand we are following a murder or suspected murder trial where essentially someone is found dead at the very beginning of the book, and then we're trying to figure out who it is that's killed this person. The next book that I read in February, I'm not going to talk about it for way too long because I feel like it's been spoken about a lot on BookTube. I decided to reread the Lunar Chronicles, which I started in February, so I started with Cinder. The Lunar Chronicles is a sci-fi / fantasy series. This series is based on different fairy tales, very well known fairy tales. So for example, Cinder is a retelling of Cinderella, but in this case, Cinderella, or the person that is supposed to be the replacement for Cinderella, Cinder, is actually a cyborg. So that's where the sci-fi comes in. I really enjoyed this. I gave it the same as I did the first time that I read it, which was 4 stars. The next book that I read was also a reread, and that is Carrie by Stephen King. This is Stephen King's first published novel. This is one of Stephen King's most well-known works. If you are not aware of what Carrie is about, it's essentially about this girl, Carrie White, who has telekinetic, I think it's telekinetic, is that what it's called? She has telekinetic powers. Essentially, she can manipulate objects and make them fly across the room and lots of different stuff like that. I think most people sort of have an idea of what Carrie is about. Blood is a very prevalent theme in this book, so if you're not good with reading about blood, don't pick this up. But if you're fine with that, then this is an interesting book. I only gave it 3 stars. That is not to say I did not enjoy it. I definitely enjoyed it, and I would definitely in the future maybe reread it again. I still very much recommend it to people, and I think it's a great place to start with Stephen King's work, obviously naturally because it is his first published book. This is one of those books where I didn't give it the highest rating, but I still would recommend it to people. The next book that I read this month is a book that I got for Christmas, and I don't know why I didn't read it before. That book is Brother by Anaya Allborn. So this I first heard about in one of Gabby Reed's videos. This was just so much fun. This follows a family of serial killers. This is set in the heart of Appalachia, so it's got that sort of hillbilly vibes. I don't like using that word, but that is sort of, if I was going to generalize, that's sort of what I'd say. It's this family that clearly something's gone wrong, because this family is just absolutely vile, but they just believe that what they're doing is right. They don't question it, they just think it's right for the most part. So there's a lot of characters in this that are just really messed up characters, but in their own eyes there's nothing wrong with them because this is just what they do and this is how they think that they should live their life. However, the character that we are following is Michael, and he is the youngest child in his family, and throughout the book he does question it and he wonders, you know, why his family's doing this. He experiences different things and it's just really interesting to read from his perspective. I feel like it would have been just as interesting to read from one of the other characters' perspectives, just because there's something about characters that are really messed up but don't actually realise it properly that I find really interesting. But nonetheless, it was a really good book. If you're interested in reading books about murder and things like that, then I would definitely pick this up. This was not as gory as I would have liked it to be, but at the same time, I don't think I have a threshold for gore, so I feel like there's a lot of people that maybe would find it quite gross. I gave this 4 stars. I honestly feel like if it was just more gory and more like in your face, that's what I'm looking for. If it was more like in your face, essentially, if that's how it was written, I feel like I would have given this 5 stars. because I really enjoyed the story. The next book that I read was again another reread, and that was Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. I read this as part of a reading vlog. I will again leave it linked somewhere. As I said, this was a reread for me. I gave it the same as I did the first time, which was 4 stars. I'm not going to dwell upon this because I feel like it's a really well-known book. If you are not aware, Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda is the film. No, it's not. Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda is the book that the film Love, Simon is based off of. So this is YA, and I 100% recommend it to people that enjoy YA. If you enjoy YA contemporary with a little bit of romance, something that's something with LGBTQIA+ rep in it, then pick this up. The next book that I finished in the month of February is a very big book, and that is The Well of Ascension, which is the second book in the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I enjoyed it just as much as I did the first book. I'm not going to say much about this because obviously it's the second book in a trilogy, but if you have read the first book, The Final Empire, or I also believe in the US it's just called Mistborn, if you have read the first book, then this one has a lot more politics in it. I really enjoyed this. As I said, I gave it 4 stars, which is the same as I gave the first book, I think. From what I have read, I feel like this feels like a very good standard high fantasy series if you want to start, and I've heard from a lot of people that this is one of the most accessible series if you are looking to start reading adult fantasy or high fantasy. The next book that I read in February is once again another reread, and that is another Stephen King book, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This is another one of his shorter books. I gave this book 3 stars. This is about a young girl who is out hiking or walking with her mum and her brother, and then her mum and her brother are arguing, so she sort of falls behind. She needs to go to the toilet, so she goes and does that, and then she loses her mum and her brother. And the rest of the book just follows her being lost in the woods and trying to figure out how to get home, and like it follows the physical effects, it follows the mental effects. In true Stephen King fashion, there is some weird stuff going on. Because it's a shorter Stephen King book, again, I would recommend starting with this maybe. It's not like super scary, but I think the scariness comes from being able to relate to the character, that if you were in that situation, it would be absolutely horrifying. The next book is another really short book, and it's actually a poetry collection. So this is the first poetry collection I read this month and this year and ever, basically. That is I Am Not Your Final Girl by Claire C. Holland. This is just such a fun poetry collection. If you like horror films, if you like the really sort of campy, well-known 80s and 70s horror films, as well as like there's some early 2000s, there's even some, maybe 1 or 2 from like, oh no, there's quite a few from like after 2010 as well, so just a good mixture of like older horror films but also newer horror films. The whole idea of this collection is, as it says, The Night She Fought Back. It's like looking at some of the female characters. Some of them are like actual final girls, some of them are not, and essentially just taking back their role in the films that they were in. It's just like a feminist poetry collection about horror movie characters. I did not give this a rating, but I recommend it 100% and I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read was the companion novel slash following, like the sort of sequel to a book that I read last year. This is Tales from the Cafe by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This whole series, if that's what you can call it, is set in a cafe in Tokyo, a cafe called Funicula. I think that's how you pronounce it. This cafe has an urban legend that if you sit at a specific table, you can go back to the past. There are some rules that are like associated with this time travel, which is something that you learn in the first installment, and each installment, or at least this one and the one before it, is split into 4 stories following 4 different people, 4 different characters. I mean, as far as this compared to the one before it, I feel like they were equally good, but I don't think this added anything. Like, I will definitely read the 3rd one once it's translated to English, but I don't think that it's like, it's not a typical series in the fact that it carries on from the story, so it just builds the world, I guess. That's sort of it's more of like a world building thing, because you obviously get to meet more people. I gave this 3 stars. I gave the first one 4 stars. The reason I gave this 3 stars is not because I thought it was any worse than the first one. I feel like I enjoyed them equally, and I think they were both equally well written, but just because this doesn't really add much, I've bumped it down to 3 stars. After that, I reread another book, which is Two Can Keep a Secret by Karen M. McManus. I was in the mood for like just easy YA mystery thriller, and therefore I picked this up. This is part of my thriller recommendation video. If you haven't seen that, definitely go and check that out. Once again, I will link it somewhere so you can go and watch it. Two Can Keep a Secret is set in a small town called Echo Ridge. In 1995, there was a high school senior called Sarah Corcoran who vanished, and no one ever found out what happened to her. And then 5 years before this is set, there's she's the homecoming queen, is how she's described, Lacey Kilduff, who is found dead. This story follows 2 twins who are moving to this town from LA, I think it was, or something like that. Their mother went a bit off the rails, and they are now going back to this town because this is where their mother grew up, and they're going to stay with their nan. The 2 twins, their mother was actually the twin of the first girl that went missing, Sarah Corcoran. So obviously they've got this like connection to it. So going back there is a bit iffy to begin with. And then when they arrive, suddenly there's murder threats and there's things going on, and essentially the killer is claiming to be back again. So there's a lot of mystery to this, and it's really enjoyable. It's really easy to read. It's not mind-blowing, but it's just, if you want something fun, if you just want something really quick and easy, then Two Can Keep a Secret is great. I also recommend One of Us is Lying. I think just in general, Karen M. McManus has got the whole YA mystery thriller down. Now we've got a couple of arcs. So the first one that I read this month is one called Shopping Spree. I don't know what to say about this book. I think if you see the cover, like, the cover speaks for itself. It was just very like campy and cheesy, but it was still a lot of fun to read. I ended up giving this 2 stars, and that's mainly down to the writing and the plot being very, I don't know, it felt very rushed. The characters feel very stereotypical and very like young. That's how they read. I mean, they are young, but they read very young. But I did enjoy this book, if only because it has like, once again, the sort of 80s cheesy campy horror film vibes. Whether I would recommend this, I don't know. If you really, if you can look past slightly not great writing and not very well developed characters and a bit of a rushed plotline, then I would recommend it if you enjoy the sort of like campy horror film thing. Otherwise, I probably would not recommend it. Then I read another e-arc, and that was another poetry collection, which this one it restored my faith in the e-arcs on NetGalley, and that is Butcher by Natasha T. Miller. This poetry collection is great. This follows a main character who is Black and who is also part of the LGBTQ+ community, which obviously representation is amazing, and it's one of the reasons that I picked up this collection. But I also found it really interesting from the description, because essentially this collection is, while it is a poetry collection, there is sort of a story going through it, and it's following this character who, after the loss of their brother, goes home and essentially is confronted with a lot of different problems, and this poetry collection just goes into depth with a lot of themes and issues that are very prominent in the world. There's talk about her mother's alcoholism, there's talk of race, there was talk about LGBTQ issues and things like that, and then there was talk about her brother and grief and going through losing someone. I once again did not give this collection a rating because I don't like to rate poetry, but I would 100% recommend it. Last but not least, the last book that I read in February was another Stephen King book, and this is once again a book that I very much enjoyed, and that is 11/22/63. I really enjoyed this. Like, I really enjoyed this. I gave this 5 stars. Amongst the people that I've heard talking about this, basically everyone loves it who has read it. So it's a really good book, and I can see why so many people love it. If you are not aware, 11/22/63 takes its name from the date that JFK was assassinated, which obviously was a big part of not only American history but just world history. This book follows a man called Jake Epping, who lives in Maine, as you would probably guess because it's a Stephen King book and almost all of his books are set in Maine. This follows Jake Epping, who goes back in time in order to try and stop the assassination of JFK, and along the way he also tries to alter history in different ways. There's different events that happen which aren't quite as important on a world history base as the assassination of JFK, but things that he feels a personal connection to that he wants to try and change. I mean, I could talk about this book for ages, and maybe I will one day make a video where I talk about this for a very long time, but I'm going to try and keep this short. I think the thing that I really enjoyed the most about this is just watching this man who is from 2011, or he's living in 2011, and he goes back to the late 1950s and the early 1960s and starts to integrate into society. And it's really interesting reading about this, these 2 decades and how different it is obviously to the day that the time that we're living in now. If you have read it, if you're a big fan of it, then there's a big section of this book where he's in Derry, and he actually bumps into different characters from it, which made my heart sing because it is the first Stephen King book that I ever read, and it's the thing that sort of threw me into wanting to read more Stephen King. So the connection between this and it was a lot of fun to read. Once again, really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it. I feel like this could be one of my favourite Stephen King books, maybe joint with it. So anyway, I feel like it's time to wrap this up because I've literally been filming for nearly an hour. That was all the books that I read in February. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to give it a like and comment down below what your favourite book that you read this month was. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, that would be really lovely, and follow my Instagram, again, that will be linked down below. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in my next one.